Well, tributes continue to pour in for South African jazz legend Hugh Masekela. President Jacob Zuma has described legendary and internationally renowned musician as a pioneer of jazz music in the country. The 78-year-old icon lost his battle with prostate cancer. With a career spanning more than 50 years, Masekela released more than 40 albums. Hugh, as he was affectionately known, championed social and cultural activism, using his music to spread awareness about the struggles South Africans were going through during apartheid years. Let's take a look at his life. Well, Masekela was born in April 1939 in Mpumalanga. At just 21, he enrolled at the London's Guildhall School of Music. The following year, he found himself exiled in New York, where American jazz legend Harry Belafonte took him under his wing. He became known as the father of African jazz, infusing local sounds to the American music genre. In 1984, Masekela joined Paul Simon, Ray Peary and others on the iconic Graceland tour. Hugh's music always included themes which would reflect the situation back home, becoming a political activist through his music and promoting African culture. In 2010, he was awarded the National Order of the Ikhamanga in gold for his exceptional contribution to music and the struggle against apartheid. Well, we're now joined in studio by Richard Nwamba, who's a presenter of African music on SAfm and Channel Africa. Good afternoon, Richard. Welcome to the desk. Always a pleasure having you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
We want to start off, it's such a profound loss, not only for the country, but the continent and the globe indeed. It's an artist whose music became symbolic of the anti-apartheid struggle. How are you digesting the sad news at this point? Some shock, some disbelief perhaps?
Yes, it's a sad day really. But of course, we always say that musicians, especially very good ones, never die, because even when they're dead, we'll continue to celebrate their music. With me, personally, it was the 1974 album that did it for me. For me, that album called I'm Not Afraid, which sits on top of an elephant. It was recorded while he was in exile. It is that song that literally became the epitome of his Pan-Africanism. Because Stimela, the coal train. Yes. It talks about, the migrant workers coming from Delago Bay to they called Maputo Bay in Mozambique. But that song was not really about just, those miners coming from Mozambique. It grew to include miners coming from Namibia, from Malawi, from Zimbabwe, from just about everywhere in Southern Africa, even from the hinterland of South Africa itself. Yes. And if you look at the way he wrote that song, he said it does not talk about them, it talks about us. Exactly. So he says we live like dogs. That's how he described the lot of the miners, showing the empathy that he had for the suffering of those miners, but for suffering of black people in South Africa.
Richard, I never had the awesome opportunity of interviewing a legend of this magnitude myself. You have several times. What is it about the man and the music that holds such wide appeal?
I think his fearlessness. He was outspoken maybe to some degree, to a way where maybe he would have, rubbed people the wrong way, including the government, because he was very critical of the South African government. Yes. I personally became very scared of interviewing him on a regular basis because, I thought, what if he says something that is going to offend the government? But that's how outspoken he was. I don't know whether it's because in 1977, if I'm not mistaken, whether 1978 or 1977, he went to Nigeria and played with Fela Kuti. Now, people who know the music of Fela Kuti is one of the most fearless of all musicians. So I don't know whether he espoused the same philosophy of Fela Kuti of speaking for the underclass, because for somebody who was well-to-do, because Hugh, unlike other musicians who died poor, he wasn't poor at all. If anything, he was wealthy, and he came from a well-to-do family. So I always try to compare him to Fela, because just like Fela Kuti, he also came from a privileged background by South African standards. Yes. But nevertheless, he threw his lot with the suffering masses of South Africa.
Well, the Americans at that time had Miles Davis, we had Hugh, and his music became very much the soundtrack of our liberation struggle, the voice for the voiceless, like you've mentioned.
Yes. I think also what made him quite unique is that sometimes when you a musician who will only speak about the struggle. Sometimes they run out of things. After 1994, people who were only writing about apartheid, they had nothing to write about, but not Bra Hugh. Bra Hugh, to him, he had this idea that he should promote African culture and African identity to a point where sometimes some people were offended. You might remember the issue of the weaves. Some people, that he would never take a photo with a woman wearing a weave. You know? So literally, he was relevant up to his death, let's put it that way.
In 2010, Mr. Masekela awarded the Order of Ikhamanga in gold. It's South Africa's highest medal of honor. And then the Hugh Masekela Heritage Festival, which started with the aim to restore our South African heritage and to uplift local artisans, which he held very close to his heart till the very end.
Yes. I think Bra Hugh should be one of those who should be studied, just like Miles Davis, as you mentioned, like Phelang Nkulapkuti. You know, because we have a tendency in this country of not having continuity. In what sense? We normally ignore a person when that person is still alive. And then when that person dies, it's only then that we celebrate them, which is horrible. What should happen now with Bra Hugh is that people should be doing a master's or PhD dissertations or thesis about his life. Why? Because then you give continuity to people who want to aspire to be like him, can learn from all the experiences that he had. And mind you, he was an exceptional writer. He wrote his own autobiography about his experience in music. That is very important for aspiring musicians, because you need to know how to go about becoming as successful as he was. So literally, he's not one for the past. He should be one also for the future, in the sense that people should study him, emulate him, and continue his heritage.
Very quickly, Richard, we are running out of time. How should we best remember a man of this stature?
Well, by playing his music, by continuing to play his music. Musicians, I always say that they have a certain measure of immortality, because even when they're dead, we continue to play. This weekend, I will be playing a full hour of Hugh Masekela on both Channel Africa and SAfm. That's how you celebrate a musician.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your insights with us on the SABC News Desk. Let's move on to some other news.